Kindia Labs presents Population Aging, the Economic and Societal Impact of Demographic Change. For most of human history, global population grew very slowly. Wars, famines, and diseases helped to keep the population in check. Then suddenly, seemingly with no warning, the population grew exponentially. While this increase happened over many years, when seen from a long-term perspective, this population surge happened almost instantaneously. If we consider this phenomenon with a slightly more narrow time frame, we see that beginning in the year 1000, population started increasing steadily. Then, in the latter half of the 18th century, the population surge began, reaching a level of 9 billion today, and forecasted to reach approximately 10 billion by 2050. This rise is astounding. From the year 1900 to 2000, a mere 100 years, human population quadrupled. For many, this rise has been the central demographic issue. Yet, if you look closely, you'll see a curiosity. Somewhere around 2007, it's impossible to know exactly when, there was an inflection point. Before this inflection point, the population was increasing at an increasing rate. Today, global population is increasing at a decreasing rate. In fact, the underlying reasons for this change are so significant that it is now very likely that the human population will reach a steady state beginning around 2050 and grow very slowly, if at all. If this prediction indeed comes true, then future historians will undoubtedly come to see this population surge as one of the most significant events in human history. For over 200 years, humanity has gotten used to living in a world with high population growth. This taken-for-granted assumption influences our economy, our policies, and our culture. Yet, that taken-for-granted assumption must now be questioned. No one alive today remembers a time of population stagnation. To understand how it will change our world, we must first go back and understand the root causes of the demographic transition. There are two key statistics at the core of population research: births and deaths. These are usually expressed as a per capita rate, births per 1,000 people and deaths per 1,000 people. The difference between births and deaths is the rate of natural increase. For most of human history, the birth rate was just above the death rate, and human population grew very slowly. With many births and many deaths, the population was very young. Then, a momentous change occurred. Death rates started falling. First, in northwestern Europe, eventually nearly everywhere on Earth. The result was a much wider gap between birth rates and death rates, a large rate of natural increase, and a population explosion. In each country, soon after the fall in death rates, there was a similar fall in birth rates, eventually leading to a final phase where both the birth rate and the death rate were very low. With few births and few deaths, the population grew older. This process is known as the demographic transition, and it is one of the most significant events in human history. The exact process has been different in each country. The fall in mortality began in Sweden around 1810, in Sri Lanka 1920. The fall in birth rates in some countries, such as Brazil, has been very steep. In others, such as the United States, more gradual. Some countries, such as Niger and Yemen, are in the very early phases of the transition. Other countries, such as Japan, Germany, and the United States, are in the final phase. To understand why the demographic transition occurred, we must first assess the root causes of the fall in death rates. The early transitions happened in the countries of northwestern Europe, beginning in the latter half of the 18th century. This was the time of the Enlightenment, and secular scientific modes of thinking were replacing religious doctrine. Early on, improvements in sanitation, particularly in large cities, dramatically brought down incidence of infectious diseases. Clean water allowed for more reliable medical care, particularly for children. New vaccinations helped inoculate the population against some of the more prevalent diseases. And the growth in wealth led to better nutrition for the upper middle classes. Over time, these improvements made their way to countries outside of Europe. In the latter transitions, countries such as India, Brazil, and South Korea saw their death rates fall once these countries were able to leverage the experience of other countries, particularly relating to vaccinations, clean water, and education. But the fall in death rates in these latter transition countries can also be attributed to better famine relief policies, new medical technology, and international coordination, particularly related to disasters and epidemics. In all countries, the fall in death rates can be attributed to a fall in infant mortality, and most importantly, a fall in infectious diseases. The underlying explanations for why birth rates fell is more contentious. Some commentators focus on economic factors. Their argument is that lower death rates led to population growth, which resulted in overcrowding, both in urban and rural areas. This overcrowding increased the cost of child rearing, while at the same time reduced the economic benefit of children. The result is that adults made a conscious economic decision to have less children. Other commentators focus on urbanization. The fall in death rates led to a rise in population, particularly in large towns and cities. These thinkers believe that it is this move to cities that ultimately led to reduced birth rates. Industrial employment led to increased anonymity. The family was stripped of its functions, and familial bonds became weaker. Moreover, the new economy increased the demand for skilled labor, thus creating a need for more education. Some researchers believe these arguments miss the mark and attribute the fall in birth rates to more political factors. In certain countries, governments implemented anti-natalist policies to actively dissuade people from having children, ranging from propaganda to the one-child policy, and in extreme cases, forced sterilization. Governments also implemented policies to provide mass access to education, which gave people the skills and dreams required to pursue meaningful careers. Finally, in many governments, the deliberate decision to increase female empowerment led to more women taking control of their reproductive capacity. For these researchers, the fall in birth rates can be attributed to deliberate decisions by governments and the policies that were implemented. Finally, there are those that focus on cultural factors. In recent decades, almost every country is seeing the postponement of marriage. This reduces the window available for childbearing. Moreover, the last century has seen a cultural shift towards individualism and personal aspiration. This has led many men and women to focus on their own self-actualization rather than child raising. Finally, many attribute the fall in birth rates to the ubiquity of birth control methods, many of which were unavailable in the 19th century. While these commentators debate the proximate causes of birth rate decline, most agree that the root cause is the strains produced by mortality decline, caused by the falling death rates during the first stage of the demographic transition. And so, it is this demographic transition that has caused the population explosion. Recall from part 1, for much of human history, population grew very slowly. Only in the last 200 years of human existence have we seen this unprecedented population surge. And yet, the surge in population is only part of the story. These shifts in rates have caused enormous demographic change. Life expectancy has more than doubled from only 30 in 1950 to 67 in 2010. Fertility has fallen sharply. Average births per woman fell from 5.5 in 1950 to 2.6 today. In 100 years, urbanization rates have more than tripled. Only 14% of humans lived in towns in 1900. Today, that figure is 51%. The global median age has changed as well. After dipping in the 1960s due to the baby boom, the median age is now 29 and will likely rise to 36 by 2050. There have also been significant qualitative changes as well, that are attributable to the demographic transition. In pre-transition societies, there was very little formal education. Status was ascribed, meaning that one's status was largely determined at birth by the status of one's parents. Gender roles were rigid. There was little scope for women to seek a career outside the home. Governments were typically characterized by autocratic rule. By contrast, in post-transition societies, children have access to many years of education. Societies are more meritocratic, with at least some social mobility. There is more freedom for women to pursue careers. And post-transition societies are largely governed through democratic rule. Together, these elements constitute enormous demographic change that was spurred by the demographic transition. In order to understand where we are moving towards, we need to examine the experiences of a few select countries. To begin, consider Poland. Many viewers will already be familiar with population pyramids. On the vertical axis are the ages grouped into 5-year intervals. On the horizontal axis are the number of men and women in each age group. In 1950, Poland had a very youthful population. Except for 2 indentations, one for each of the world wars, Poland's population pyramid was very bottom-heavy, typical of a country in the early stages of the transition. By 2000, Poland's pyramid shape had changed dramatically. There was a bulge in the center. At that time, Poland had many workers with few children and few elderly to take care of. This shape reflects many demographic advantages associated with the large number of workers, such as strong economies, growing tax revenues, and lower expenses relating to dependence. Countries with this pyramid shape are said to reap a demographic dividend. But by the year 2050, Poland's pyramid will have changed again. The bulge that started at the bottom of the pyramid and moved through the middle will now be at the top. Poland will be a very old country, with large numbers of people aged 65 and older. In particular, there'll be many women over 80, as women tend to live longer than men. This inverted pyramid is very disadvantageous. Large numbers of elderly will put a strain on the small number of workers, and the small number of children mean that the demographic challenges will likely be exacerbated in the future. The population will age quickly. Poland will be a fast-aging population because of its unusually low fertility rate. Today, the highest fertility rates in the world are in Africa, where in some countries, women are still giving birth to more than 6 children on average. Fertility rates above 6 used to be the norm. But even in countries such as the Philippines, India, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia, those rates have fallen dramatically to between 2 and 3 births per woman. For a population to replace itself, women must have on average 2.1 births. In many large industrial countries, fertility has now fallen below that level, and these countries are no longer producing babies at the rate of replacement. Poland is characteristic of a few East European and Southeast Asian countries that have the lowest fertility in the world. In fact, more than 50% of countries have below replacement fertility. Next, consider the United States. In 1950, the U.S. had a very favorable population structure. A bulge in the working age population meant that the country was reaping the benefits of a demographic dividend. But also, there was the beginning of the baby boom, a large number of men and women between the ages of 0 and 4. By the year 2000, the pyramid looked just as favorable. There was still a large bulge in the working age population. By 2050, trends suggest that the U.S. will have a surprisingly uniform pyramid, with roughly the same number of people at each age group. How does the U.S., with fertility below replacement, not have a fast-aging society similar to Poland? The answer is immigration. The U.S. has a net migration influx of 3% a year, one of the highest in the world. This influx of immigrants helps the U.S. offset the declines in the workforce population due to aging. As the challenges of population aging become more acute, countries will be recruiting immigrants rather than turning them away. Those countries with a tradition of accepting immigrants will have an advantage. To understand a different challenge, consider Nigeria. In 1950, Nigeria had a youthful pyramid, indicative of a pre-transition society, a small population with a bulge at the bottom. By the year 2000, Nigerian death rates started to fall slightly, but fertility rates remained high. The country was still in the very early stages of the transition. By 2050, Nigeria's population will have grown substantially. Most demographers predict that the population will be youthful as birth rates will not have fallen to the level of death rates. Even in 2050, Nigeria is likely to be only midway through the transition. Nigeria is characteristic of many countries in Africa that are going through a population explosion. Thus, the experience of the demographic transition in each country not only affects the composition of the population, but also where people live. North America's share of the world population will fall from 5.1% to 4.8%. South America's share of the world population will fall from 8.6% to 8.4%. Western Europe's share will fall from 6.7% to 4.8%. Eastern Europe's share will fall from 6.8% to 3.6%. Asia's share will fall from 57% to 53%. Japan's share will fall from 2% to 1.1%. Australia's share will stay the same at 0.5%. The Middle East's share will grow from 3.3% to 4%. And Africa's share of world population will grow from 14.2% to 21.7%. Finally, consider the case of Japan. In 1950, Japan had a population pyramid typical of a pre-transition country. By the year 2000, Japan had a very favorable structure and was reaping some of the benefits of a demographic dividend. But by 2050, Japan will be a very old country. The largest cohort will be the 80-plus group. Japan is one of the few countries on Earth whose population is actually falling. Japan's population reached a peak in 2005, and it has been declining since. Many commentators believe that the reason why Japan's population is in decline is because it has completed the demographic transition. If that is so, then Japan is our model of the future. But is the Japanese experience universal? Not necessarily. Japan has very low immigration. There is less equality for women. High costs of childcare and high costs of real estate make it difficult for young families to get started. So no, Japan's experience is not universal, but there are still useful lessons that can be taken from the Japanese experience. Number one, there have been some profound economic changes. New markets have opened up to serve Japan's aging population. This includes new forms of housing, new recreational activities, and new consumer products. Second, by necessity, the Japanese government has implemented pension reforms in multiple waves in order to put the public finances in a better position. Still, Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio of large industrial countries. Japan has suffered low GDP growth for over 2 decades, which is partially, but not completely due to their changing demographic conditions. There have been cultural changes as well. Many Japanese are now living alone. Many children do not have siblings, leading to a lonely children meme common in Japanese film and television. The elderly are living alone, as are young people who are postponing marriage. There is also a deep unease within Japanese society. In recent surveys, 80% are worried about the future. Some fear economic collapse due to pension liabilities and a lack of risk-taking. Many perceive a real loss of vitality. The experience of these 4 countries each provide different lessons on how countries are managing their demographic transitions. Most countries are likely to experience an aging population in the not-too-distant future. How will that impact our societies? Most countries are now midway through the transition, and their populations are growing older. In this section, we now turn to the impact of population aging. Some predictions about the impact of population aging are obvious. We might call these first-order impacts. While these are not guaranteed, there is a high degree of certainty that they will occur. Some of these first-order changes will have knock-on effects that will lead to second-order changes. These second-order predictions are a little more speculative, but if they come true, they will have knock-on effects as well, which could lead to third-order changes. The fourth-order impacts listed here are very speculative, but if they come true, it will represent a very different world than the one we have today. We consider the impacts in 4 categories: macroeconomic, political, microeconomic, and social-cultural. To begin, economies are very likely to experience reduced savings. The largest savers are those in their 40s and 50s. As people grow older, they tend to draw out their savings to pay for their retirement. There will also likely be a shortage of workers. As people grow older, many retire, leaving a smaller share of working population. Some argue that many elderly will continue to work into old age. This will undoubtedly be true, but the baby boom was so large. If only a small share exit the workforce, it will create a shortage of workers. Large numbers of elderly will put strains on pensions, both private and public. This strain on pensions will put stress on government finances and will lead to pension reforms such as higher retirement age, already implemented in countries such as Japan, Canada, and Chile. Some governments will try to boost their working population by bringing more women into the workforce and by increasing immigration where politically possible. Initially, the shortage of workers will likely lead to lower unemployment and higher wages. Good news for most. However, weak stock markets will likely be the norm as older people sell their investments to pay for their retirements. These retirees will still spend and generate aggregate demand. New markets will open up to serve this growing customer segment. In particular, medical care and recreation will be 2 hot sectors in the coming years. When we look to Japan, we see surges in a few industries as well: health and wellness, tourism, and home remodeling as people adjust their homes to suit their changing needs. Many commentators predict new consumer products, from clothing to entertainment and lifelong learning. Some futurists predict large growth in the market for automated robots to improve the overall quality of life for an aging population. While the aging baby boomers will certainly spend, they are likely to be less risk tolerant, which will reduce the overall risk-taking in society. Since the baby boom cohort is so large, this will likely lead to a lower risk of inflation and lower GDP growth. At the extreme, this could lead to low interest rates for the long term and a risk of economic stagnation, as we see currently in Japan. From a social perspective, it is likely that we will experience continued urban growth as more people wish to benefit from the amenities that cities provide. New forms of housing and new forms of transportation will emerge that provide shared services and amenities that are fine-tuned to the needs of an aging population. As more people have more time, there will be more advocates for causes large and small. This will likely lead to greater political engagement, specifically related to issues of public spending. If governments are unable to reform their pension structures soon, they will reach a point where they must choose between reducing benefits for the elderly or raising taxes on the workers. This could lead to generational tension and possibly a realignment of political parties along generational lines. If unresolved, this tension could lead to frequent political crises. Finally, from a cultural perspective, nostalgia will be in fashion, particularly in film and television. Society may become more religious and more conservative, yet government's role in society may grow as there will be more importance on public services. As the enormity of the demographic transition becomes apparent to all, society is likely to become more introspective and think more deeply about the human experience. The demographic transition was one of the most significant events in human history. The impact is so dramatic that the human population grew from 1 billion to 7 billion in the blink of an eye. This increase is even more remarkable when we consider the possibility that in the not-too-distant future, human population will likely stabilize. Thus, this increase is a momentous one-time event. And it's not just population that has increased. Our way of life has undergone a profound transformation. Life expectancy has doubled. Fertility has halved. Urbanization has tripled. And the median age is creeping upward. There have been qualitative changes as well. Countries that go through the transition become more educated, more egalitarian, and more democratic. The mechanisms of the demographic transition are easy to understand. Birth rates and death rates start out at similar levels. Then death rates fall, creating a population explosion. Soon after, birth rates fall, leading to an aging society. The reasons for the fall in death rates are varied, but are ultimately related to a fall in infant mortality and a fall in infectious diseases. Explanations given for the fall in birth rates are also varied, but the ultimate cause is the fall in death rates in the previous stage of the transition. To understand the phenomenon more deeply, we examine a few specific countries. Nigeria has a very youthful population with a bottom-heavy pyramid. Nigeria is typical of an African country, which will soon have a much greater share of the global population. Poland is a fast-aging society, due in part to one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. America too has low fertility rates, but the population is more balanced due to high immigration. Japan's pyramid is perhaps the most instructive. Not only is the population aging, but it is also falling. Japan is in the final stage of the demographic transition, so there are many insights that can be gleaned. The most important may be that shrinking populations hinder economic growth. As we look to the future, we can imagine several impacts due to an aging world. Economic growth will be dampened, yet in other ways, society will be better off. There will likely be more political engagement and perhaps new forms of culture as we reflect on the human experience across a large expanse of time. Once the demographic transition is complete, human population is likely to stagnate or grow very slowly. At that point, we will reflect back on the enormity of what just occurred for our species and for our planet.